Dear colleagues, students, and friends, welcome to the SOAS China Institute Research Seminar. My name is Lu Xiaoning, and I am a reader in modern Chinese culture and language at the SOAS. It's my great pleasure to chair today's webinar featuring Professor Jason McGrath. Professor McGrath is a professor in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Minnesota. He is also an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature, as well as the graduate program in Moving Image, Media, and Sound Studies. He is the author of numerous publications on Chinese cinema and literature. His first book, Post-Socialist Modernity, Chinese Cinema, Literature, and Criticism in the Market Age, was published by Stanford University Press in 2008. More recently, he published Chinese Film, Realism and Convention from the Silent Era to the Digital Age. This book came out with University of Minnesota Press in 2021. And this book has received wide acclaim. For example, Dr. Victor Fan from King's College London describes it as one of the most ambitious, thought-provoking, and groundbreaking works on the subject to date. Besides being an inspiring piece of research, the book also provides a solid method of critical analysis that is highly accessible to university students of all levels without compromising the complexity and the nuance of its discussion. It is truly a pleasure to have Professor McGrath with us today to share insights from his work. For today's webinar, Professor McGrath will speak for about 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. If you'd like to ask a question or share a comment, please use the Q&A box. You're welcome to remain anonymous, but if possible, providing your name and affiliation would help us better understand the question of the context of your questions. Without further ado, let me now hand over to Professor Jason McGrath.
Thank you so much, Professor Liu, and thanks to FISA for facilitating the technology here. Thanks also to Lisa Whittington, who was a great help in organizing all this and tolerating my belated sending of materials occasionally. It's a real pleasure to be here, and greetings from what remains of the United States. We're currently in mid-plunder. And here at the University of Minnesota, it's actually our spring break. I was discussing with my students late last week what our plans are for spring break. And I said, well, the good news is I'm giving a talk at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and there are few cities I'd rather walk around than London. The bad news is I'm giving it virtually, so I'm just going to be sitting here in Minneapolis the entire time. Here in Minnesota, it's actually, we have a sort of 早春三月, a very early spring, but even that is not so pleasant because temperatures in the 20s Celsius in early March are also no doubt some kind of portent of doom if you live in Minnesota. In any case, I will begin sharing a PowerPoint and start my discussion. Let's see. Is that working?
Yes, perfect.
Oops. Oh, I can't seem to advance it anymore. Huh. Let me try this again. Okay, here we go. So I was asked to speak about my recent book, um, and maybe I'll just give a little bit of an overview, and then what I plan to do is kind of concentrate on two historical moments covered in the book, two of many possible ones. But I think the two I've chosen might help sort of clarify what the overall method of the book is. The two moments I'll look at are, as you can see from the images here, the Cultural Revolution cinema, which is I spend an entire chapter on, and then what a moment of what I call post-socialist realism, which is a term that I used in my earlier book to refer mainly to the so-called sixth generation or urban generation filmmakers, but actually I've kind of expanded the concept now to cover a wider variety and wider historical period of the post-Mao era. But I think these two moments help to illustrate the overall sort of methodology of the book, which began really I had the idea for this project as early as when I was in graduate school, even though I was already underway with a different project. But the idea was rather simple. It was just why, so given that realism is such a key term in modern Chinese culture and literary studies and so on, and cinema studies, why are there multiple books in English on realism in Chinese literature, but there's not yet an entire book-length study of realism in Chinese film? And that was the idea. And over the years, it sort of changed and developed, and I more and more realized that you can't really talk about realism without talking about convention. So the basic concept became more one of a sort of dialectics of realism and convention. And I I put this all into basically 7 chapters. And the problem, of course, is when covering a historical scope of this type, any of the 7 chapters could have been a book in itself. And in fact, I often think I could only have decided to embark on such a massive project when I was young and ambitious and perhaps a little stupid. I don't think now I would ever try to do something on that scale. It is rather daunting, but this is the result is a book. It's about 400 pages. This is the cover, and you can buy it in as a paperback or hard copy. But most importantly, I wanted to emphasize there is an open access manifold edition of the book. And that edition has 80 plus film clips as well as other extra things, features that are embedded into the text. So you can read the entire text for free online, and it has film clips, full color images. Some of the images that are black and white in the book are full color in the manifold edition, and then other extra materials like some links to other sites, or like film trailers and things like that. But basically, every scene in the book that I discuss at any length from any film has the scene itself embedded into the text where you can just click and watch the scene yourself. So I hope that makes it easier for readers who are not necessarily familiar with every film that I discuss, or for instructors who are using it as a textbook. Um, Oops. Sorry, once again, I'm having trouble advancing.
Maybe Jason, just click on the
Oh, here we go.
left side panel.
Okay. Can you see the side panel?
Yes, I can see the side panel.
Oh, that's
Just click
strange.
on it,
I
it's
can't.
fine. Don't worry.
Huh. I thought we fixed this before, but I guess not. In any case, this is what the online edition looks like. This is just a screenshot, and you can see the URL at the top.
Pardon, we only see the first slide, Chinese film history as a historical dialectics.
Oh, strange. Okay. I'm not sure. what the problem is. How about now?
Yes, I can see the book cover, Chinese film. Yeah,
Can you see the read online?
it's very small, the font. I can see a lot of text.
Okay. Well, this is the screenshot of the online edition. I
Mhm.
wonder why this is not working. Can you see the table of contents now?
No, only the book cover. Oh, yes, now I can see table of contents.
Oh, okay. And now?
Table of contents, yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, sorry. We did test this, but sometimes things work out when you test them and then they still don't work out when you do the actual event. Anyway, this is a brief overview, the table of contents. So it starts in the 1920s, and basically there's a chapter on the sort of discourses of realism that were already embedded in modern Chinese culture when cinema began, and certainly at the height of the silent era in the 1920s to early 30s. Then there's an entire chapter studying the so-called left-wing cinema movement of the 30s, focused on detailed readings of a couple of the classic early sound films. And then I have a chapter covering the late 1940s, the immediate post-war period. And then I have two chapters covering the 17 years and the Cultural Revolution. That's chapters 4 and 5. And if any of you are familiar with an, an article I published years ago in the Opera Quarterly, which seems to have at least the statistics tell me many people have downloaded it. Basically, that article is expanded greatly and developed into two full chapters, and then a chapter on the what I'm calling post-socialist realism, and finally a chapter dealing with digital cinema and questions of realism in contemporary Chinese cinema. Um, so I'm going to move on to just some of the basic concepts that organize the book, and these are all sketched out in the introduction to the book and then developed further in other chapters. First, I found that in order to talk about realism, you quickly find that that can mean so many different things. So for the purposes of sort of analytical effectiveness, I divided the idea of realism into 6 broad categories. Now, these do not mean categories into which you would necessarily put different films. In fact, they're categories that you could use for, you could theoretically use any of them for any given film to analyze it. It's just different meanings of realism that have played out in film studies. And some of these will be quite familiar to anybody in film studies. A couple of them are more idiosyncratic to my project. And I should emphasize, I don't think these are exhaustive. I can think of other categories of realism that one could discuss. They're just not as relevant to this project, but I don't at all think this covers everything. So can you see now number 1 in categories of cinematic realism?
No, still the table of contents page.
Well, this is going to be difficult if
Yes,
I can't.
now we can see categories of cinematic realism.
Okay, you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, I'll just have to leave it this way then. Um, Okay, so these are the 6 categories I came up with. The first is ontological realism, and this is probably very familiar to anybody in film studies. Basically, the idea that cinema intrinsically, that live action cinema intrinsically has the realism that is a property of photography in general, at least traditional photography, in that the technology of photography provides a uniquely intimate and direct connection to external physical reality because external physical reality directly inscribes itself onto the film. So what's sometimes called indexical realism. And this, of course, would be from the famous Bazin essay on the ontology of the photographic image. The second category is perceptual realism, which is analytically distinct in that you can have an image, say an animated image or CGI, that feels fully immersive and realist, and yet has no basis in external reality. But our perceptual apparatus perceives it as real when we watch it. And then the third category is the more broad category of fictional realism, which is to say the tendency of cinema to be an immersive experience in a broader sense, where we suspend disbelief and take the film as provisionally real for the purpose of identifying with characters and enjoying the narration. And that has to do with just the general broader idea of diegetic absorption beyond just perceptual realism. And closely related to that is the idea of social realism, which in my scheme is not necessarily critical. It's not necessarily the same as critical realism, but just more broadly, whether when we watch a film, we take the fictional world as corresponding to what we take to be reality, including elements like social and cultural and historical feelings of realism, say its representation of class or gender or ethnicity, all those kinds of social categories. And then finally, the last two are a little more idiosyncratic. I use the term prescriptive realism to mean that a film might represent not just reality as it now is, but a truer or deeper reality that's yet to be fully realized, so that it encourages such a realization. This is the broader term into which I fit the category of what's generally called socialist realism. There's the phenomenon of the so-called realism that developed out of the Soviet Union in the early 30s and was adopted in various ways throughout the communist world. And when you show these films to students, they might say, but it's not really realistic. It feels like propaganda or things like that. But it is, in its own way, trying to be a realist representation. And I go into detail in this in my chapter, how people like Mao Zedong himself acknowledged that this kind of realism is not simply a surface level realism, but is trying to show a deeper reality or a future reality, and that's part of its purpose. So I put this in a broader category because I think in some ways we can take a lot of films as fitting in the same category. Films, especially that represent great acts of heroism, or a lot of even Hollywood action films, you might say, fall in this category. And then finally, there's the category of apophatic realism. This is the realism that tends to be associated more with art films, but I also relate it to some of the Chinese critical realist films of the 1930s. And this is the idea that sometimes there's a film that points to a real beyond representation, that uses devices such as elliptical editing, off-screen space, gaps in narrative communicativeness to construct the impression of a fictional world that contains an inherent unknowability, and that unknowability is itself realistic. And this would apply in some ways to some of Bazin's ideas also about like Italian neorealist films. Like he was interested in how they used ellipses, for example, to show that we don't always know everything in reality. So those are the six basic categories of analytical categories of realism that I use. Beyond that, hopefully you see a new slide now. Beyond that, I use the dialectics of realism and convention basically comes from an essay from 1921 on realism and art by Roman Jakobson, where he, toward the beginning of that essay, he identifies two broad trends of realism or broad categories of realism. And these would be, in a way, opposites, although one can turn into the other. So one is the tendency to remain within the limits of an artistic tradition conceived as faithfulness to reality. In other words, what we were told is the way to do realism, whether it's following a filmmaker that's acknowledged to be realist and imitating that style, or in the case of, for example, painting at the time he wrote this in the 1920s, this would be more the academic realism taught in art academies at the time, based on the history of realism of the last several hundred years from the Renaissance on. The other tendency, though, is the idea of deforming given artistic norms in an attempt to force a new confrontation with the real. So the first is to accept a set of conventions considered to be realist, and the second is the idea that these conventions themselves can become a barrier to a confrontation with reality, and that you have to deform the conventions in order to force a new confrontation with the real. Of course, at the time Jakobson wrote this, that would correspond to the various avant-garde movements in the arts in the early 20th century. So I'll move on to another key touchstone of a lot of the book, which is I draw a lot on Jörg Schweinitz's book, Film and Stereotype. And maybe I'll pause for a moment to see, do you all see this slide that has the...
Yes, we can see.
Okay, great. So I use a few terms from this book. This book was first published in German and then translated into English. So the word is stereotype, but really what Schweinitz means by stereotype is much more broad. He defines it as conventionalized representational patterns shared and accepted by artists and viewers within a given period. And so basically, this would correspond with what I term as convention in the book. And he discusses a few different processes that can result from the use of these stereotypes or conventions in films, particularly, for example, in genre cinema of a particular historical period. So one is the process of conventionalization, the standardization or codification in an intersubjective field of a particular set of stereotypes, broadly speaking. So this would be how, for example, genres form through a process of conventionalization, where we begin to go into a film knowing the types of conventions we're going to see because of the genre it is. And then another process he describes is derealization. This is when a convention's connection to reality is suspended or lost. And these are the moments that I look at carefully in the two examples that I'm going to give today, this process of derealization, which I think of as a moment through which historical change happens in film history. Another process he describes is one of secondary semantization, which inscribes the customary context of use onto the repeated sign so that conventions or stereotypes take on a referential function that points to the given context, for example, to the text type or genre in which they have developed. This is simpler than it sounds in that description. It basically means a particular convention from for example, previous period of filmmaking, when repeated in the present, can represent that entire period of filmmaking just by citation of a particular convention. So to illustrate this, in my chapter 4, I believe, of the book, I discuss the convention of the landlord, the character type of the landlord in Chinese film. So here you have the landlord on the left, the white-haired girl, and on the right, red detachment of women. So these are a little over a decade apart. Or no, they're almost exactly a decade apart. And of course, they're both played by the actor Chen Chang. So this is a case, as Professor Liu has studied and published about, this is a case of so-called villain stardom, where even the actor involved helps to establish the character type as soon as we see the character. So this, of course, became a highly conventionalized, stereotypical character in films of the revolutionary period, the evil landlord, and very recognizable, particularly when it uses the same actor as in this case. So that would be the process of conventionalization, establishing a character like this. And then the process of secondary semanticization is evident, for example, I'm sorry, this would be the further process of conventionalization would be in the Cultural Revolution films. So this is the same landlord character from Red Detachment of Women as represented in the revolutionary model ballet and the revolutionary model opera. And you can tell even from the costuming how conventionalized it had become, this character. But then the process of secondary semanticization is evident in these films from the Mao era, the post-socialist era. On the left, of course, that is Troubleshooters, or the Santi Company. That's from 1988. And then on the right, this is Party A, Party B, Jia Fang Yi Fang, one of the Feng Xiaogang New Year's films. And in these films, the landlord can reappear as a character type, and it's actually played for laughs in both of these films. These are comedies. So it's making fun of the previous era of filmmaking just by citation of this one character type. So that's an example of the types of processes that Jörg Schweinitz discusses. So I'm going to move on to the two examples I want to discuss. One is, how did films of the Cultural Revolution, which you would think would be a culmination in the tradition of revolutionary realist cinema in China, how did they actually become one of the most formalized genres of popular film in the history of cinema anywhere in the world, I believe? And then, so that would seem to be a contradiction, a tradition of realism culminating in such an extreme formalism. And then the other example I'll look at is, how did what I call post-socialist realism, or we could say post-socialist neo-realism, emerge as a reaction against the conventions of revolutionary cinema, but also itself become conventionalized to the point of becoming a kind of formalism. So these are two processes that kind of illustrate the overall dialectics of the project. The first one I'll look at is the Cultural Revolution films. And we can only understand these in the context of Chinese revolutionary cinema history, beginning with the left-wing cinema movement of the 1930s and 40s. So of course, we generally think of the cinema of that movement as being an example of critical or social realism, where progressive or even revolutionary filmmakers showed the contradictions and the shortcomings of contemporary reality in a way that implicitly called for change or possibly even revolution. This was canonized within the official communist film historiography as, progressive for their time, but not quite yet proper socialist realism. And that would come, of course, in the 1950s and 60s after the establishment of the PRC. This, broadly speaking, is in the category that I call prescriptive realism, mentioned earlier. So films that want to show not just the surface level reality or problems of society, but want to show the deeper structure of reality, which is to say the Marxist view of reality as being framed by class conflict and the historical change towards communism, and then also representing the future, the the hopeful future of communism through what would become more romanticist tendencies. And this is why, beginning in 1958, even in the official communist terminology, they were not using socialist realism anymore as a term or just revolutionary realism, but saying films should be a combination of revolutionary realism and revolutionary romanticism in an acknowledgement of the kind of non-realist romanticist element that's often present in these films. That revolutionary romanticist tendency culminates, in my view, in the Yang Banshi films of the Cultural Revolution, the films of the revolutionary model theater of the time. Some model ballets, but particularly model operas, which of course borrowed from the conventions of Beijing opera. So that would be the culmination in the 60s and 70s of the revolutionary romanticist tendency, and particularly what I call socialist formalism. Socialist formalism is a term that, for example, David Bordwell has used to speak of certain moments in Soviet filmmaking. Of course, particularly the 1920s experimental cinema of people like Eisenstein, but also some later filmmakers that used formalist tendencies despite ostensibly being in a socialist realist tradition. So I view the films of this time as an example of Chinese socialist formalism. And that's, of course, the key contradiction is how can something called realism evolve into what is in fact a formalism. I look in this chapter not just at the revolutionary opera films, but also at the wave of films, particularly in 1974, that were remakes of earlier black and white revolutionary films that were now remade in color. You can see one example in this slide. The 1955 film Gorillas on the Plain was remade in 1974, and the title changed slightly in both Chinese and English, but it's a very faithful remake. Most of the dialogue remains the same. Most of the script remains the same. And I do analyze in the book some of the moments where it doesn't, but mostly it remains the same. And you can see even from these two images of a relatively inconsequential moment, how they even often imitated the mise en scène of the earlier film. So one reason why I look at these films is that you can see how the shift away from realist aesthetics goes beyond just the stylization of opera aesthetics in the revolutionary model opera films. In these films, with the remake, what you have is an interesting loss of what Philip Rosen has called the indexical credibility of cinema. And I'll just briefly outline this argument. In the chapter that deals with this, I premise the idea of indexical credibility on the fact that even a fiction film can be considered a documentary of its actors' performances. So the actors' performances are directly recorded, as well as the objects around them, the mise en scène, the props, the setting, and so on, studio sets. All of those are captured in an actual documentary manner in front of the camera. So a historical film offers an image that represents not one but two pastimes, according to Philip Rosen. It represents the time of the historical events, but also the time of the film's making when the fictionalized performance was shot. So strictly speaking, only the latter, the film of the performance, possesses the ontological realism or the indexical realism of the photographic image, the direct existential link between the people and objects being filmed and the resulting image that we see. But in connecting the fictionalized representation of history to the actual historical events, the film transfers the ontological realism of the recording of the performance and then lends an indexical credibility, as Rosen says, to the fictionalized representation of history. Or this also relates to what Bill Nichols has called the indexical stickiness of the documentary image. It has an intrinsic realism due to its ontological connection with the thing being filmed. But what happens when we watch a historical film and it becomes our prosthetic memory of the actual historical events is that the ontological realism of the moment of performance, as captured on film, gets transferred in a way to the actual historical event, so that our idea of history becomes filtered through this film image, partly because of the intrinsic ontological realism of the film image, which is not to say that audiences naively believe they're actually looking at history. It's more of a subconscious process of increased credibility. But the problem is when you have these remakes, the repetition loosens that connection. It loosens the indexical stickiness or the indexical credibility of the representation of history because audience are so aware that they're watching a remake of a previous film. So it kind of introduces a new link in the chain that distances the image currently being watched from the ostensible history that it represents. So that's one way that Cultural Revolution era films departed from the sense of realism and became more obviously conventionalized to the point of some degree of derealization in Schweinitz's terms, meaning audiences would sense I'm watching a film, I'm watching a remake, not I'm witnessing history or I'm getting the truth about history. Another example, of course, is in the revolutionary model opera and model ballet films, which just the conventions of opera and ballet and the highly artificial sense even of the mise-en-scène of these films. They're so obviously shot on studio sets, not on location, for example, also would result in a process of derealization and of the audience being aware of the conventionalization that they're seeing. So here's an example I use through those two chapters in the book. I often return to Red Detachment of Women simply because it was made 3 times into a film. So on the left here, you can see an image from the original film by Xie Jin from 1961. And this is the moment when the communist hero Hong Changqing is burned at the stake by the evil landlord. It's one of the most intensely emotional moments in the film and one of the most heroic moments because, of course, while he's about to be burned alive, he's shouting, "Long live the Communist Party," and so on, in a very typical heroic gesture. But in that film, even though it's definitely a revolutionary romanticist moment of heroism, at the same time, it still uses elements of realism. For example, his clothes are dirty, he's sweaty, he looks a little dirty. It's making gestures toward this being a real moment, as the audience is supposed to sense this is a real moment, this is real fire, this guy's really about to burn. When we see the same moment in the Cultural Revolution model opera and model ballet films, you can see on the right how much it changes. The top image is the same moment from the model ballet. The bottom image is from the model opera. And it's become so highly conventionalized and the romanticism of it so accentuated that the audience could not but experience this as a very formal moment, as a very cinematic, obviously cinematic moment, rather than a representation of history. And that corresponds, of course, with the heroism of the protagonists in the Cultural Revolution model opera films, achieving a level of extremity with the formula of the so-called 3 prominences, where the great hero has to stand above all the other heroes and above all the other positive characters and be the most prominent figure and almost basically be a superhero. And in that strange way, contemporary Hollywood superhero films arguably have something in common with the revolutionary model opera films. So that's the other example of how films of this time went through a process of derealization that made them increasingly less realist and more formalist. The other example that I will quickly run through is in a later chapter in the book, the discussion of post-socialist realism. So I draw in this chapter on an earlier work I did on mainly on Jia Ke, where I called him and a lot of his sixth generation peers what they're doing post-socialist realism. And I said in that book, this aesthetic is post-socialist both in the sense of being a successor and contrast to the previously dominant aesthetic of socialist realism, so post-socialist realism, and in the sense that it's a realism of the post-socialist condition, or post-socialist realism, if you will. So in these two senses, these films depart from the tradition of socialist realism. And in the first sense, they reject the aesthetics of socialist realism and go for what many have noted is more of a neo-realist aesthetic. In the second sense, they try to represent the reality of post-socialist China in a way that was not previously represented. So an example that I use is going back to the Jia Ke film Xiaowu, his first feature-length film from 1997, which I feel like in retrospect looks increasingly like a kind of turning point in the direction of what I'm calling more broadly the post-socialist realist tendency, which I believe actually began not with the sixth generation, nor even with the fifth generation, but even with some of the fourth generation films of the early 1980s. You already started to see things like longer takes, on-location shooting, these characteristics of neorealism that were introduced partly to counter the formalist aesthetics of the Cultural Revolution. So in Xiaowu, of course, we have all of these. It was shot on location without permits. It used non-professional actors. It tends to use long shots and extreme long shots and some long takes, which of course is supposed to be a characteristic of neorealism. So all of these things were introduced in a fairly radical way with films like this in the late 90s. But the historical development happened rather quickly. Even by a few years after Xiaowu, we had films, some that come to mind, for example, are Blind Shaft or Orphan of Anyang. We had lots and lots of films that were kind of following the similar aesthetic of Xiaowu, to the point that that aesthetic itself became highly conventionalized. In other words, these neo-realist techniques became repeated so much that it became its own sort of commodity, quickly recognizable on the world cinema circuit. And my favorite example to use for this process is the observation of the well-known critic and programmer Shelley Kraser, who put it this way, that by the end of the 2000s, the first decade of the 21st century, that while Jia Ke himself had struck out in what Kraser calls new directions, as he puts it, Jia's cinema, through its profound effect on most younger independent Chinese directors, seems lately more restrictive than liberating in its influence. Film language in mainstream indie Chinese films, both documentaries and features, seems to have temporarily congealed into something like formulaic liturgies, fetishization of the long take, the distant camera, the objective tone, the unedited minutiae of daily life. So this is, again, a process of derealization where the same conventions that in one historical moment strike viewers as surprisingly, shockingly, interestingly realist in contrast to mainstream entertainment cinema, for example, become so conventionalized and identifiable as referring to previous films that they no longer feel so realist. Of course, Jia Ke himself seemed to have recognized this. He quickly departed from the formula of Xiaowu Of course, he's kept some elements of that neorealist aesthetic, but he, for example, in The World started incorporating animated sequences, which were very non-realist. In Still Life, he incorporated strange, surreal moments of CGI. And I think I'm getting toward the end of my time, so I'm just going to just briefly highlight one element of this process of derealization as it applies to post-socialist realism, and that's the long take. So the sixth generation filmmakers, including Jia Zhangke, were known for adopting the neorealist tactic of the long take, which was considered part of their practice of realism. But how long was it actually? In Xiaowu, for example, the average shot length is 40 seconds, which is quite long compared to mainstream standards. The median shot length in that film was 19, so a little less than half that, because really there are a handful of very long takes in Xiaowu. But for the rest of the film, the average shot length is not actually that long. But Jia Zhangke himself would take this to more of an extreme. Even with his very next film, Platform, the average shot length extended all the way to 68 minutes, so more than 1 minute per shot, and the median shot length increased to 47 minutes. So Jia himself took this more to an extreme. And then other filmmakers since then, which I'll say belong more to the digital generation of contemporary filmmakers, took this to even more of an extreme. One example, of course, is Liu Jiayin's Oxide 2. This is from 2009, all shot on digital video. And the entire film shows the director's own family talking while making and eating dumplings. The film lasts 2 hours and only has 9 shots for an average shot length of about almost 15 minutes per shot. And then each shot is shot at a 45-degree angle from the previous one as the camera gradually circles the table on which they're making and then eating the dumplings. So while this film, for example, has many of the standard markers of neorealism, on-location shooting, non-professional actors playing ordinary people, and so on, it still comes off as a formalist experiment rather than a realist film because its long take style is so extreme and its technique of rotating around the table by 45-degree increments almost feels like a formalist experiment. Another example would be An Elephant Sitting Still, the later Hu Bo film, or Kylie Blues from 2016, I believe, 2017. This is a film that featured one take of 41 minutes, which you see part of here. It's an example of how something identified as realist, like a long take, the more it's used and the more it's experimented with, can depart very much from realism. In fact, this long take in Kylie Blues feels quite surreal. It feels kind of oniric. It goes on for 41 minutes, but it does not feel realist so much as like a surreal tour through some of the themes and echoes and doublings of the film as a whole, which is not, well, arguably not so much a realist film as a representation of subjective experience. So that's just one example of, or one more example of how the aesthetics of post-socialist realism started with the first of Jakobson's categories, started as a set of conventions acknowledged to be realist and also as a rejection of the previous real aesthetics of socialist realism, but then became so conventionalized that it becomes its own form of formalism. And I will conclude with a last slide that just shows like a general mapping in this context of post-socialist cinematic legacies of Mao era prescriptive realism. And one one category would be a negation of the prescriptive realism of the Mao era, which would be what I've been talking about, post-socialist neo-realism of the fourth, fifth, and sixth generations up to the present, where it's become sort of formalized. And then an opposite reaction would be a kind of continuation of the prescriptive realism tendency in the contemporary era. And this would be, for example, in the main melody films that have heavy patriotic themes. You can see here the Founding of a Republic, the Wandering Earth films, Wolf Warrior and Wolf Warrior 2, or what I call capitalist realism, drawing on others have used that term to not to describe the domination in the current world by capitalism, which some have also used the term capitalist realism, but more the fact that some films, and the example here is Go Lala Go, some contemporary films show a kind of idealized representation of capitalism and seem to serve a prescriptive function in that they're teaching the audience how to live in a capitalist society, which is really a new form of prescriptive realism itself. And obviously for any of these, I could go into much more detail, and there would be a lot of nuance that I'm not covering here, which is true of the book in general. I think anybody who's written a book knows that by the time you finish, you are very well aware of all you're leaving out and all the various ways that your analysis could be complicated or challenged. I think I could write such a devastating review of my own book that I'm tempted to write it under a pseudonym or something, but to preempt whoever else might write it. But I haven't yet done that. So I will stop now, and I'll stop sharing and hope that we can have some general discussion.
Oh, I need to turn on my lights, otherwise it's too dark. Thank you so much, Jason, for this wonderful, fascinating talk. It's really truly impressive that you use realism as a lens to trace the history of Chinese cinema. And in this talk, you already gave us many, many examples. I think even more inspiring is the way you develop the 6 paradigms, analytical terms, grounded in empirical research. This really offers a model for how regional studies can contribute to broader theoretical discussions. And I really like you use the term prescriptive realism to bring 2 historical periods together, the socialist time and the capitalist time. So it's a really, really interesting way to read what ought to be or our idealized life. And yeah, I was also struck by your use of, for example, the terms of a secondary semanticization. When you look at how post-socialist cinema rework or respond to the previous the film work from the previous era. So you used the example of a landlord, a typical evil character, and later on, the evil landlord has been laughed at, mocked at, because our social economic condition has shifted. We have different values. So I think a parody works very well. Parody is a very good example of a secondary semanticization. I wonder whether there are other examples, not parody, maybe other examples of a secondary semanticization overall, or what kind of a type of characters, or maybe the storylines.
Yeah, the example that Jörg Schweinitz uses in the book is the Coen brothers film. Oh, now I'm trying to remember the name of it. Hudsucker Proxy. Relatively less watched Coen brothers film, but that film, a particular character in that film is played by Jennifer Jason Leigh, the great American actor, and it's completely clear that her whole persona in the film is trying to draw on a Katharine Hepburn type figure from early sound film from, say, the 1930s. She's the scrappy, woman reporter, and she speaks in a very fast voice and that kind of fake Atlantic accent that American actors used at the time. That's kind of somewhere between American and British English, and really only existed in Hollywood. And she's very effective at imitating that. So he uses that as an example, and it's not so much parody as nostalgia or homage. So I think, these borrowing these conventions from the past doesn't necessarily have to be parody or satire. It can also be nostalgia. And I think it'd be worth asking, for example, how much does a film like Wolf Warrior 2 sort of resuscitate the heroism, the impossibly fantastic heroism of, say, Cultural Revolution films for the present day? Um, and I wouldn't call that parody. But I would call it prescriptive realism. Um, but also arguably is using some of the same conventions. But yeah, I think the whole idea shows of secondary semanticization shows that the original the concept that I use from Roman Jakobson, of course, he was a formalist theorist, and he did not necessarily speak directly about his ideas as a process of historical change, but I think they're most effective when we look at actual history and how does the historical real sort of force these changes in cinematic aesthetics and even in audience perception. Another example is, for example, acting styles in films of the 1950s. I'm always struck that there were these method actors in Hollywood films of the 1950s that my parents' generation took to be extremely realist, shockingly realist in their performance method. I'm thinking, for example, of James Dean or Marlon Brando, in On the Waterfront or Rebel Without a Cause. They thought that acting style to be strikingly, shockingly realist in the context of classical Hollywood. By the time I watched them, they seemed strikingly mannered to me. So I became very interested in the process of writing the book in how realism is not just something that changes like the films change, but actually our perceptions change. So how realist a film is dependent partly on when we watch it. Um,
That's
and
interesting. Even I'm thinking about the radio broadcasting voice. Some of the older broadcasters' voice now sounds so artificial, so strange. Great. We have one question from audience member, Bart Hester. I'm going to read out loud. You seem to place socialist formalism, operas and ballets under the wider social realism. How can these be joined when the first is tougher and passionate, while the latter is subject to such derealization? I wonder whether this question is clear. It's quite dense. And it's in the Q&A box. It's about a socialist formalism.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the wider social realism part. What I trace is a development from what was canonized as social realism or critical realism of the 1930s left-wing films, how that developed into the sort of socialist realism proper of, say, the 1950s. And this is the kind of development that would be traced, for example, in the history of the development of Chinese cinema, the official history published in the early 1960s, that would say that those social realist films were progressive for their time and anticipated our later socialist realist films, but we didn't arrive at the proper formula for communist art until we got to socialist realism, which of course meant more conventionalization. And that's an oversimplification because those 1930s films also engaged very heavily the conventions of classical Hollywood cinema. And my chapter on that period does deal greatly with that. But I also argue that they went well beyond those conventions as well. And they undermined those conventions in various interesting ways. And that was part of their revolutionary practice. But then in the socialist era, the 1950s, you would have socialist realism proper, which was in fact the term used in China from 1953 to 58 only. Before 1953, they used the term proletarian realism more. And then, in fact, Mao used proletarian realism in his talks at Yan'an in 1942. But when they were republished in the 1950s, they actually changed the word he used to socialist realism to conform to the Soviet Union's formula. By the late 50s, of course, there was the growing Sino-Soviet split and the growing romanticist element within socialist realism. And that's when they changed the formula from socialist realism to the combination of revolutionary realism and revolutionary romanticism, which I believe directly points to the later, more extreme formalization of the Cultural Revolution model opera films, for example. So I think I think that my answer to the question, if I understand it correctly, is that these are very different. I completely agree. And that what's interesting is to look at that historical progression and ask why it happened. And for our answer to be, on the one hand, changes in film aesthetics through these sort of intrinsic processes of conventionalization and derealization, as identified by Schweinitz. But also, on the other hand, and I get into this in my chapter, but not so much in my talk today, the changes in the sort of ideological status of communism within China with the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution and with the sort of what I draw on the work on the Soviet Union that identifies a performative shift in ideological rhetoric, where people stopped taking ideological rhetoric to be coincident with reality itself and took it more as self-evidently performative, and that this is a process that actually can lead to sudden change, can lead to things like parody, for example. And so I identify the shift to formalism and film aesthetics with a broader ideological shift under the Cultural Revolution, where say the revolutionary fervor of the Red Guards in 1966 may have become the cynicism of the post-Mao era, beginning with the late 1970s, but particularly into the 1980s and beyond. So yeah, I guess that would be my answer. How can they be joined? Only by discussing a very broad historical process that explains the changing aesthetics of the films.
Okay, next question is from Professor Zhu Ping, UCSD, University of California, San Diego. Could you please talk about the differences between capitalist realism and the post-socialist realism?
Sure, and thank you. Good to see you, Professor Zhu. Yeah, I think the way I use capitalist realism is as a new form of prescriptive realism, which is to say, representing a sort of idealized world of how to be successful in the contemporary global capitalist environment. And that's part of the prescriptive realism of China today, as China occupies a more and more central role in the global post-socialist, mainly capitalist economy. Whereas post-socialist realism, I mean to be the films from the fourth generation up to some of the independent filmmakers working in digital video today that want to counter the fantasies of both socialist realism and maybe of capitalist realism, including not just capitalist realism, but also the other forms of prescriptive cinema today, like the so-called main melody films, or just Hollywood fantasies, in that the post-socialist realist films want to use these typical neo-realist tactics like shooting on location, non-professional actors, just the mobility of digital video, for example, to capture a reality that's ostensibly lies outside of these ideological representations. So a classic example would be the way that, for example, Jia Zhangke himself said that his purpose in making Xiaowu was to show the reality of the massive transformations happening in his own hometown of Fenyang in the 1990s. And he said when he went to see officially released films in China, he didn't see these realities being represented. He only saw fantasies, but he wanted to show the reality of these transformations. So that would be the kind of claim typical of post-socialist realism, whereas capitalist realism would tend to be a more high-budget, formalized kind of filmmaking that celebrates the new era of capitalist prosperity and maybe presents an idealized image of that. Hopefully that helps to explain the difference.
Okay, so next one is from Aaron Lang from at Florida State University. Thank you, Professor McGrath, for your insightful talk. My question concerns the term post-socialist, which you frequently used in phrases such as post-socialist condition, post-socialist China, and post-socialist aesthetics. Could you clarify the scope of this social political term? Does it specifically refer to the period immediately following the Cultural Revolution, or is it still relevant in describing contemporary China? And then on your specific slide, post-socialist cinematic legacies of a Mao-era prescriptive realism, you included films produced during the mid-2010s. So we can call all Chinese cinema today post-socialist Chinese cinema. Is that right? So a lot of interest in post-socialist cinema.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great question, and I think quite a difficult one. I don't think I have a simple answer. When I wrote my previous book, Post-Socialist Modernity, I began writing it right after the turn of the century, and I was particularly focused on the 1990s. And it felt easier at that time to talk about post-socialism. Of course, today in the Xi Jinping era, I think there are legitimate arguments about whether we can so simplistically call China today, the PRC today, post-socialist, or simply describe it as, with the trend of marketization in the 90s and then the joining of the World Trade Organization in 2001, it seemed easier 20 years ago to simply talk about China as being post-socialist. And more importantly, in that book, the argument I make is that post-socialism is a global condition. So what we're really looking at beginning in the 1990s, really with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet sphere, and then with the ongoing market reforms in China that began in the reform era of the 80s, but really accelerated afterwards, that we globally have basically lost the alternative vision of modernity that was provided by the communist movement that began in the early 20th century and was an inspiration throughout the world, including, even in the United States, the left in the 1920s, 1930s, into the 40s drew inspiration from that as the alternative to capitalism. We seem to have lost that because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, because of all the problems of Stalinist Soviet Union and post-Stalinist Soviet Union, as well as Maoist China. We seem to have put that behind us. So really, I think of the entire world as still being in a post-socialist condition in that sense. In that sense, we could maybe call all cinema throughout the world, post-socialist in some sense. But I also recognize that this is more complex than that, that we might be able to argue that a film such as, let's say, Wandering Earth 2 presents us with a vision of a neo-Confucian, neo-socialist or pseudo-socialist, paternalistic China as being better prepared to lead the world through the crises that we will face in the future than the Western world as it was when that was made, and maybe even more so today when we're not even sure, is there such a thing as the West anymore as of the last few weeks? So, of course, this is all in flux, and I think the idea of post-socialism is increasingly raises more and more questions, and I'm not sure I have the answers to those. And probably if I wrote a new chapter for the book 20 years from now, I might have to really rethink a lot of these things.
Okay, a question from an anonymous attendee. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm thinking about that prescriptive realism seemingly manifests as a certain self-fulfilling prophecy, especially when it involves institutional orientation or direction. Say, for example, recollection or re-narration of the Korean War with a wave of patriotic historic films. In this case, it may be more formalist. Could you please say a bit more about the combination of a prescriptive and formalist realism?
Yeah, that's very interesting. In the book, the basic historical progression I trace is, while I call the films of the 17 years prescriptive realism as a broader category into which I put the Chinese version of socialist realism, and then I call the films of the Cultural Revolution socialist formalism, as a way of describing how the conventionalization of prescriptive realism reached a point that it became its own kind of formalism, meaning that the audience itself can recognize the formalism or the performativity of the repetition of these conventions, as opposed to feeling like they're seeing a direct representation of history that's convincing as like our cultural prosthetic memories. I would love to hear more about the re-narration of the Korean War, and if I feel like I'm not keeping up with contemporary cinema well enough in China to feel sure about how to answer this, but it would be interesting to see if some of the current prescriptive realist films, say of the so-called main melody films endorsed by the government within China, main melody or mainstream, the Zhuxuanlu films in China, are they also involved in a process of formalization, of being conventionalized to the point of sort of breaking down the sense of connection with history? It seems like that's what the question is suggesting, and I find that really interesting, but I'm not sure I know the contemporary films that are referred to well enough to say with any certainty whether I think that's happening. But certainly you could say that anytime you have prescriptive realism, it can repeat conventions to the point of feeling more like a type of formalism.
Great. We've got more questions coming in. Shirley Crisser, you quoted him, I think, in your presentation. Do you think it's useful to see prescriptive realism today as broadly embracing things like gender-related realism or feminist realism? What about 少数民族偏 films today as ethnic realism, for example, new Tibetan New Wave, 拍马才 dance films.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point. And my instinctive answer is yes. I would think that, part of prescriptive realism, even in a film like Go La La Go, is presenting new examples of gender performance. And for that matter, Wolf Warrior 2, um, new or not so new or resuscitated examples of models for gendered performance that the audience implicitly it should follow, whether it's a sort of a new type of new woman, that we had like in the 30s and in capitalist Shanghai. Maybe we have a version of that now with the prescriptive realism of something like Go La La Go, or the revival of hyper-masculinist heroism that maybe we can trace from Hong Chang-ching and Red Detachment of Women, particularly the opera and ballet versions, to something like, Wolf Warrior 2. Um, and I think there's a lot of not just ethnic, but regional cinema in China today that's its own, makes its own sorts of claims to realism, representing ethnic minorities in a less conventionalized way, particularly by filmmakers who are themselves intimate with those communities, which includes Kylie Blues, actually, because that filmmaker is part Miaozu, or other regional cinemas, representations of region in or locality in China today, I feel like is a trend that we see in recent years that's arguably its own form of a new form of kind of neorealism as applied to a particular place or community.
Okay, since you just mentioned Wolf Warrior, I'm going to bring in Professor Nick Cardy's question. Great talk, thank you. I've only managed to sit through the film Wolf Warrior once, and I recall lots of overlaps with contemporary Rambo-type Hollywood action film. Can you indicate where it is working in a Cultural Revolution era visual aesthetic tradition, as you just indicated? Thank you.
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, in my own discussion of Wolf Warrior 2 in the book, I draw on previous analyses of the Rambo films as melodramas, um, which I find extremely convincing. How it's a similar representation of somebody. It's basically somebody whose nation has failed to appreciate their sacrifices, their patriotic sacrifices. And then you have a sort of through action and through a lot of blood and suffering, the sort of creation of the moment of recognition of the heroism of somebody who was previously unappreciated. It's a very melodramatic form, model of narration in those films. I'm not sure that I would argue the film's return to a Cultural Revolution era visual aesthetic tradition, because I don't really think something like Wolf Warrior 2 looks more like a contemporary Hollywood action film than it does like, a Cultural Revolution model opera film, for example. But the role of the hero, um, you might be able to say, if not, it's the same visual tradition, but could you, like, for example, use the idea of the three prominences as the Cultural Revolution formula to analyze a film like Wolf Warrior? Um, I haven't tried to. I don't do that in the book, but I wonder if you could, because I feel like it presents the similar prescriptive vision of how to achieve your ideals in the world, how to promote your ideals in the world. And I would say the same thing about something like the Wandering Earth films, and how science fiction can also become a new type of prescriptive realism if it's tied to the sort of new ideology being promoted by the state.
I've read two related questions from Professor Karen Hui. So love your talk. It's so good. How do you think revolutionary realism and the revolutionary romanticism different from socialist realism? I understand the former has to do with the PRC and the latter with the Soviet Union. And does the derealization necessarily mean conventionalization and formalization?
Yeah, great questions. I I feel like you could probably write a whole book about just the terminologies used in various locations for what we broadly lump together as socialist realism. So I use socialist realism as the sort of blanket term for the forms of art officially promoted by the communist bloc countries from the 1930s to, say, the 1970s. Um, I use socialist realism as the broad blanket term, and then I use prescriptive realism as an even broader term to point out that these films are not unique in their presentation of a sort of idealized world, that we can also look at various forms of Hollywood genre cinema as doing similar things. So I use the term prescriptive realism partly to overcome any sort of knee-jerk bias in the West, particularly to dismiss socialist realist films as mere propaganda, because I think they're much more interesting than that. And I think using the term prescriptive realism forces us to recognize that, for example, this is in the book and I use this example in class. If you look at what happens in certain scenes in Red Detachment of Women, the original one, and the most propagandistic moments, seemingly the most formalized moments that represent the most revolutionary romanticist aesthetics, you can find very similar moments in, for example, Hollywood war films of the late 1940s and 1950s celebrating the American participation in World War II. You can find very similar techniques. So I think these techniques are not unique to socialist realism, but are much more broadly apparent. I generally I like to just highlight the way the wording changed within China as a historical fact, which I went through earlier, how it tended the new form, the new realism. Zhou Yang, as early as 1936, talked about, okay, social or critical realism is fine, but now we need a new realism. Beginning in the 30s, you had communist cultural officials in China talking about this, and Mao, in his talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Arts, talked about this. That tended to be called proletarian realism, and the socialist realist label began in the Soviet Union in the early 1940s and was adopted in China for a few years in the 50s. And then the official term became revolutionary realism and revolutionary romanticism. I don't really think any of these are entirely distinct aesthetically. They're all related. And in fact, if you look at the discussions of socialist realism in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s by people like Gorky or Zhdanov, they actually already were using the term revolutionary romanticism already in their formulation of what socialist realism should be. So that element of it was always there, I believe. So I don't make such sharp distinctions. Oh, and I'm trying to, I lost Professor Hui's question. I'm trying to remember the second part. Oh, here it
Is
is.
does the derealization necessarily
Yeah.
mean the conventionalization?
I think in Schweinitz's terms, because I borrow all these terms from Schweinitz, um, I think what he would say is the process of conventionalization eventually leads to derealization. Um, and maybe, and then in using the term socialist formalism, I'm emphasizing that it can be derealized to the extent of being identifiable as not a realism at all, but a formalism. So I guess that's how I would summarize that.
Okay, thank you very much. So next question is from, if I pronounce correctly, Luis Filippo Baute. Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking seminar. My question is this: do you see a deeper or more intense connection between recent Chinese films, say films from last 5 to 10 years, and the popular genres in a transnational sense, considering that we see more Chinese films in different international markets, and that might change conventions altogether?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I haven't necessarily thought it through in these terms, and I feel like I'm not as on top of all the contemporary films of the last few years as I should be, but it strikes me that as the Chinese box office becomes the world's largest, uh, Chinese films actually are dominating that box office, whether it's the, patriotic sci-fi films like the Wandering Earth films, or patriotic war films like Wolf Warrior 2, or things like Nujia, the Nujia phenomenon, the new the 3D animation, which if you watch that film, I went to see it a couple weeks ago in a movie theater in 3D, with the glasses and everything, and it's hard to ignore that with, say, Wandering Earth 2 or Nujia 2, Chinese CGI, for example, or animation or 3D aesthetics is world class these days. It's equal to Hollywood at least, and because the Chinese box office is so big, not only is Chinese film aesthetics adopting transnational aesthetics in a smooth way, which I think goes back to the vast expansion of the animation department at the Beijing Film Academy beginning like 20, 25 years ago, and how they've mastered all the things they see coming from abroad and can imitate it well. But also, Chinese aesthetics can Chinese filmmakers can introduce their own aesthetics and contribute that to global cinema culture, which of course has always been happening. Hollywood, copied Hong Kong cinema beginning at least 25 years ago, to the extent that if you watch a Hollywood action film today, you almost wouldn't realize the influence of Hong Kong because it's so permeated Hollywood filmmaking. But I think the Chinese films of the last 10 to 20 years definitely are more connected with transnational cinema, and maybe are themselves in a position to change transnational film aesthetics, as even Hollywood wants to sell tickets in China, because that's where the box office is these days compared to, say, North America.
We only have time for one final question, and this is from Sanfu Tsai at Bow Valley College at Calgary. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk, Professor McGrath. Could you share your thoughts on how films produced in Hong Kong or Taiwan may have influenced or reshaped post-socialist Chinese cinema?
Certainly, and first, talking to anybody from Canada, I feel like I should first say I'm so sorry as an American today. It's so embarrassing. Anyway, yeah, one of the massive gaps in my book is that I do not leave mainland China. And actually, there was an earlier version of the plan for the book where I would. And my own former PhD advisor helped talk me out of it because he said it would get so complicated if you, say, used Ho Xiaoshen as your example of apophatic realism, which I think I could well do. But, the film histories of Hong Kong and Taiwan are so distinct that I, in the end, decided not to consider them. In fact, my current work is more in Taiwan studies. Since I finished this book, I've been working more only on Taiwan, actually. So I mean, this is a very broad question, and I think, you know, we would have to get into not just, for example, how, say, the aesthetics of Hou Xiaoshan were a huge influence on Chinese sixth generation filmmakers like Jia Zhangke, who has acknowledged that and in fact chose, as the same Japanese producer that had been funding Hou Xiaoshan's films, chose to use that producer for many of his early films because he admired Hou Xiaoshan's films so much. So I think you can take a lot of filmmakers that I'm calling broadly post-socialist realist and show a huge influence from New Taiwan cinema, of course. But beyond that, the way the industries have become intertwined, from especially between Hong Kong and the mainland, but also Taiwan, it's impossible to talk about post-socialist Chinese cinema today without also acknowledging that it is transnational. It's almost intrinsically transnational now, and by not just transnational, but also, you know, trans-regional with Hong Kong and Taiwan in particular. So yeah, I definitely agree with that, and that would be quite a long discussion in itself to answer that question, but it's a great one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jason McGrath. We are right on time, and I'm very looking forward to your next new book on Taiwan cinema. And thank you so much for your time, for your wonderful talk. And I'd also like to thank our audience members for active engagement, and for thank you to Visa for taking care of everything here. So I hope to see you next time in our research seminar. Thank you. Have a good evening or good day.
Likewise, thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to Professor Liu for moderating, and to Lisa Whittington for putting this together. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. Have a good spring break. Bye.